Welcome back. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. Tonight, we travel back to a time of mud and stone, of cold mornings and empty stomachs, to medieval Europe, somewhere around the year 1000, or perhaps 1100. The exact year does not matter, because for the people we visit tonight, every year felt much the same. You are not a king tonight. You are not a knight in shining armor. Tonight, you are something far more common, far more ordinary. Tonight, you are a peasant, a serf, bound to the land. One of millions of forgotten people who fed the world and received almost nothing in return. Let your breathing slow now. Let your eyes grow heavy, because the story of the medieval peasant is a long and quiet and exhausting story, and it will carry you gently into sleep. In medieval Europe, almost 9 out of every 10 people were peasants. 9 out of 10. Think about that for a moment. While kings sat in castles and knights rode horses and priests read books in quiet stone churches, 9 out of every 10 human beings were working in fields, from before sunrise until after sunset, every single day. There were 2 kinds of peasants: the free peasant, called a villein, who could own a small piece of land, and the serf, who could not. The serf belonged to the lord, not as a slave exactly, but close enough. The serf could not leave the village without the lord's permission, could not marry without the lord's permission, could not even grind their own grain into flour without paying the lord a fee to use his mill. The lord owned the mill. The lord owned the oven for baking bread. The lord owned the wine press. The lord owned almost everything. And the peasant owned almonds, almost nothing. The peasant's day began before the sun, long before. In the deep, cold darkness of early morning, the church bell rang, and the peasant rose from a bed that was not really a bed, but a thin straw mattress on a dirt floor, shared with the rest of the family, sometimes shared with the animals as well. The pig, the few chickens. Their body warmth kept the small cottage from freezing. The cottage itself was very small. 1 room, sometimes 2. Walls made of wattle and daub, which is woven sticks covered in mud and straw. The roof was thatch, bundles of dried reeds or straw, layered thick to keep out the rain. There was no chimney. The fire burned in the center of the floor, and the smoke rose slowly and drifted out through a hole in the roof, or simply filled the room. The eyes of medieval peasants were often red and irritated from a lifetime of breathing smoke indoors. Breakfast was small, a piece of dark, heavy bread, perhaps some pottage, which was a thick soup or porridge made from whatever vegetables were available. Turnips, leeks, peas, beans, sometimes a little salt, rarely anything more. And then, before the sun had fully risen, the peasant went to the fields.
The fields were everything. The peasant's entire life revolved around the fields. In spring, the soil had to be plowed. Heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen, turning the cold, hard earth, row after row after row. The peasants walked behind the plow, in wet mud, in cold morning air for hours and hours. Then the seeds had to be sown by hand, walking slowly across the field, reaching into a cloth bag and scattering seed left and right with every step. In summer, the fields had to be weeded on hands and knees, pulling weeds from the hot soil. Under the full weight of the summer sun, there was no hat, there was no shade, there was only the work and the endless rows of growing grain. Harvest time was the most urgent. Every able body worked. Men, women, children, even the very old. The grain had to come in. Before the rains came, before the weather turned, cutting wheat with a curved blade called a sickle, bending, cutting, standing, moving forward, bending again, cutting again, for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours, until the light completely failed. And even then, some continued by moonlight, because the harvest could not wait. After the cutting, the grain had to be threshed, beaten with wooden flails to separate the seed from the stalk, then winnowed, tossed into the air so the wind could carry away the chaff, and the heavier grain fell back to the ground, then carried to the Lord's mill, where a portion was taken as payment before the rest could be ground into flour. And even that flour was coarse and dark and heavy, nothing like the soft white bread of kings. After the harvest was gathered, the peasant did not keep it all, not even close. First, a portion went to the Lord as rent for the land. Then, a portion went to the church, called the tithe. 1/10 of everything you produced, 1/10 of your grain, 1/10 of your vegetables, 1/10 of your animals' offspring. Then there were fees for using the Lord's mill, for using the Lord's oven, for using the Lord's wine press, for getting married, for inheriting land when your father died. There was even a tax, simply for being a serf, called the shevage, paid once a year, just to acknowledge that you belonged to the Lord. After all these payments, what remained was what your family lived on for the rest of the year. In a good year, it was enough, barely. In a bad year, people starved, quietly, and without much notice from the world above them. Disease was everywhere in the medieval village, without clean water, without understanding of how illness spread. Sickness moved through families and through villages, quickly and silently. Children were especially vulnerable. Many did not survive past the age of 5. Parents buried children with a quietness born of long experience, with grief that had no words. The average peasant was old by 40, worn down by work, by poor food, by cold winters, by the accumulated weight of a life spent in service to the land and to the Lord. And yet, they continued, every morning, rising before the sun, going back to the fields, because there was nothing else to do, because this was the life that had been given to them. At the end of the day, when the last light faded, the peasant returned home, to the small dark cottage, to the smell of smoke and animals and damp earth, to a bowl of pottage, eaten in near silence, too tired for conversation, too tired for anything. And then, the straw mattress, the heavy woolen blanket, the warmth of the family, close together in the dark. Outside, the village was completely silent. No lights, no sounds, only the wind moving slowly through the grain field, through the bare trees, through the cold, quiet darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, the peasant slept deeply, completely, with the heavy, dreamless sleep of someone who has worked with every part of themselves all day long. Let that heaviness find you now. Let the fields go quiet. Let the village disappear into the dark and let yourself drift slowly into a deep and restful sleep. Good night.